Thanks a million, Joe, for that introduction. It's lovely to be here today, and a huge thanks to Dublin Port as well for inviting me to take part in today's events. So I'm going to look at the civil war in the northern inner city in Dublin. So going back to the attack on the forecourts and beyond into 1923. So I suppose leading up to the civil war that did break out in June 1922, why it broke out? Well, we have one of the major events, which was the occupation of the forecourts in April 1922 by members of the anti-treaty IRA executive, which included Rory O'Connor and Liam Mellows and many others. And the building was taken over with ease. It was the last symbol of British administration, British justice in Ireland. And this is at a time in April 1922 where it looks like civil war will break out, but there are attempts to stop it from actually happening, certainly by the military. And this is really an affront to the provisional government because, as I said, the building's taken over with ease and the provisional government, the pro-treaty side, do not act. And there's a very good reason why they don't act, and it's best summed up by this man, Pádraig O'Connor, who is a member of the 4th Battalion of the Dublin Brigade of the IRA, who went pro-treaty. And he explains to here the reason that the pro-treaty side didn't act against the forecourts executive. And he says that we numbered 800 ranks in all. The 2nd Eastern Division was 500. With the 200 from Kilkenny, it was reckoned we would have 1,000 men available in Dublin. So that's all they would actually have in the National Army to act against the anti-treaty forces. To oppose this force, the irregulars, the anti-treaty side, had in Dublin an estimated force of 3,000 men. And there was in the country a force of 20 to 40,000 men. So they were completely outnumbered. It was hardly likely that their HQ staff would remain in the forecourts to be bottled up, nor was it likely that they would allow us to defeat our Dublin force and gain undisputed control of the city. Now, another factor was that the pro-treaty forces could actually not trust their soldiers because a lot of men, right up to the outbreak of the Civil War, they were switching sides or deciding to take no part whatsoever. But another huge factor in the reason why the provisional government didn't act is because the anti-treaty IRA were very well armed at this stage, and that was thanks to the capture of the warship the Up-Nor in Cork. Now, up to this point, although they have the men, the anti-treaty IRA didn't necessarily have the weapons, but it all changed with the Up-Nor, where they captured about 1,500 rifles, 55 Lewis guns, 6 Maxim guns, 3 Vickers, 500,000 rounds of ammunition, 1,000 each revolvers and .455 automatic pistols with ammunition, 300 hand grenades and some rifle grenade throwers. So this is now the weaponry that the anti-treaty IRA have. So it changes everything. So the provisional government do not act. More so, the military do not act, even though you have politicians like Arthur Griffith urging Collins to do something, but they don't for very good reasons. Now, the occupation of the forecourts happens in April. Civil war doesn't begin until June 1922, and this is what the forecourts executive, the members of the anti-treaty IRA in the forecourts, were doing at this time. Now, these photographs are from the McHenry collection, some are from military archives, but it shows that it's a group of people that are not expecting civil war to break out. These are posed photographs. You can see this one on the left is the captured armoured car, the Mutineer. And in this group of people, you have Paddy O'Brien, who was actually the commanding officer of the forecourts garrison, and was hampered by the fact that he had people like Rory O'Connor and Liam Mellows in the forecourts as well. And then the photograph on the right, I love this. This is Paddy Rigney, a member of the 4th Battalion of the Dublin Brigade anti-treaty. And there he is lying across the roof of the forecourt. So this is not a garrison that are preparing for war. And you have various accounts from people who are in the forecourts who say they were not prepared, and we'll come to that in a few moments. But you have this tension building up, and really from the 22nd of June 1922, it begins to increase, and pressure is put on the provisional government to do something thanks to the assassination of Sir Henry Wilson by members of the London IRA on orders that had been given by Collins earlier that had never been rescinded. And Sir Henry Wilson, he was a thorn in the side of the IRA. He was a supporter of the violence that was breaking out all across the north. And here we have a very dramatic depiction of his assassination. Now, once this happened, you've got Huge pressure coming from Winston Churchill on the provisional government to act against the Four Courts, because he wrongly believed that it was the Four Courts that gave that order to carry out the assassination of Wilson. They had nothing to do with it. And as members of the executive said themselves, it suited the provisional government for the Four Courts executive to be blamed, but they'd nothing to do with the assassination of Wilson. Now, you've got, as I said, Winston Churchill is putting pressure on them. He is saying to the British Commander-in-Chief, General Macready, that if they don't do something about the Four Courts, they will. However, Macready realised if the British actually attacked the Four Courts garrison, that could actually reunite the IRA. It was too big a risk. And not only were the anti-treaty IRA well armed, so too were the pro-treaty side very experienced men. Churchill backs off and eventually Collins does act, but it is events closer to home, and it is the kidnapping of General Ginger O'Connell. Now, this was in response to the arrest of one of the Four Courts garrison, a man called Henderson. He and a number of people from the Four Courts were carrying out a raid on Ferguson's garage in Baggot Street. This was part of the Belfast boycott. There was a raid on the garage and you have Henderson arrested. So it was decided by the anti-treaty IRA that they would kidnap a high-profile pro-treaty figure, and they kidnapped General Ginger O'Connell. Now, because of this, Collins is then forced to ask, despite the fact that you have huge pressure coming from Britain at this time, and an ultimatum is given to the Four Courts garrison from Tom Ennis, one of Collins's close figures, close associates throughout the War of Independence and beyond. And this is the ultimatum that was delivered to the Four Courts garrison. And he says, I, acting under the order of the government, hereby order you to evacuate the buildings of the Four Courts and to parade your men under arrest without arms on that portion of the quays immediately in front of the Four Courts by 4 a.m. Failing compliance with this order, the building will be taken by me by force, and you and all concerned with you will be held responsible for any life lost or any damage done by order. Tom Ennis. There was no response from the Four Courts garrison, and at 4:07 in the morning of the 28th of June 1922, the bombardment of the Four Courts began, and this is seen as the opening of the Civil War. Now, to show how unprepared the anti-treaty side were, we have this account from Sean Prendergast, who was a member of the 1st Battalion of the Dublin Brigade of the IRA, and his witness statement just shows the shock and the fact they could not believe actually that civil war had broken out. And I'll just read out what he says to you, writes in the account. And he says, on Tuesday night, 27th of June, the Dublin Brigade IRA was urgently mobilised for immediate action as the staters are going to attack the Four Courts. Conforming to that order, our 1st Battalion Commandant Paddy Houlihan issued mobilisation orders to respective companies, the main portions report at 44 Parnell Square, others at the Fowler Hall, and our C Company at Tara Hall in Gloucester Street. It so happened that at the time of the issuing of these orders, I and my 2 junior officers and 1 or 2 other members of the company were at the Plaza Picture House. They're actually at the cinema when the order to mobilise comes in. Waylaid on leaving, we were served with the mobilising order, which we were inclined to treat as a huge joke. Joker was not, as we soon learned and realised. What a rude awakening indeed. One moment we were in the height of merriment, the next plunged into the infernal affairs of an armed enterprise. Mobilised the men, every man to his allotted task. Soon the clarion call was brought to the 4 quarters of the city, wherever our men lived, arranging the dispatch of all our warlike materials to the selected rendezvous. No more bewildered and inquisitive party paraded in that hall than ours on that fateful June night, as they arrived in 1s and 2s to give effect to the orders they had received. Now, pretty much that is the way the anti-treaty IRA feel at that moment, not just in Dublin, but across the country. And here we have a map of the Four Courts. So you have the main section under the dome. There's the headquarters block, which is behind the section of the dome opposite the Bridewell. And very importantly, we have the records office here. And in the records office, that is where you had those documents, centuries old documents, but tasked with looking after that position where the orderly section, made up mainly of Nafina, who Sean Lamass, who was in the Four Courts, he actually disagreed with them being in that position because they were young men, they were inexperienced men, and this was the worst area to be in because this is where the munitions factory was, all of the gelignite and everything else was stored there. And here we have, in this list here, you can see that quite a number of the men in that section are from the North Inner City area. Getting back to how ill-prepared or unprepared the anti-treaty IRA were in the forecourts, we have Ernie O'Malley's account. And he's in the forecourts, and what he says, that when the fighting actually breaks out, communications between the blocks was in the open. The Dome area was cut off from the headquarters block, the latter from the records office. The space was covered with rifle and machine gun fire. One man was hit as he crossed behind me. Paddy O'Brien and I found men to work in a sandbag barricade, but there were not enough bags to make a covered, bulletproof passage between the blocks. So they had started to barricade the building, but stopped. So while the fighting is going on, they're actually trying to erect barricades. They started to dig a tunnel, an escape tunnel, but they stopped, and when it's too late they begin to redig the tunnel, but it was flooded, so there's no actual escape route. Now Simon Donnelly, who was also in the forecourts, he continues with again the situation. And he says that things were busy all Thursday night and early on Friday morning. Enemy launched a very heavy artillery attack on 3 posts of the building, supported by all other arms. Now, the 18-pounders, we always see the 2 18-pounder guns that were trained on the forecourts. Actually, 3 18-pounder guns attacked the forecourts. And as Donnelly says, one gun was moved up to Tavern Street Bridge, about 100 yards range, and protected by a fleet of armoured cars. Another was planted at Green Street at the rear of the courts, and a third gun played from the direction of Bridge Street. The enemy authorities had apparently made up its mind to destroy the building and its garrison as they realised the men were prepared to see the job through. The bombardment continued for many hours. About 11 a.m, incendiary bombs thrown into the GHQ block, in which was the chemical shop, took fire owing to the inflammable substances in the building. Orders were issued to all men to retire to the other side of the courts, that is the portion next to the quay. They got over by means of a tunnel which had been dug under the road. I was directed to see this portion of the building clear, and myself and Father Dominic were the last to leave it. Shortly after GHQ block had been cleared, a terrific explosion occurred which shook the building to its foundations. A large quantity of explosives, some say as much as 2 tons, was exploded by the fire, and roofs, windows were falling and walls were falling in all directions. Now, for 3 days you had the bombardment being carried out on the forecourts, and finally on the 30th of June we have the first of the 2 explosions which Donnelly has just described there. Now, we actually have a man who was in the public records office when it goes up. And that brings us back to this man, Pádraig O'Connor, because he was actually tasked with trying to make a breach into the building. You have Joe Leonard, who is another Free State officer. He was attacking it from the other side. But Pádraig O'Connor and his men are actually in the records office when it goes up. So, to read out his account, what he says, in a short time, it was observed that the block I was about to attack, which is the Public Records Office, was on fire, and that the fire was rapidly spreading. I received in return an order to attack immediately. I stood for a moment to give orders to the sergeant standing just inside the door. The block was blazing fiercely, the flames reeling across 25 to 35 yard gap that separated us. The heat inside the records office was unbearable. I'd only started to instruct the sergeant when an immense explosion rocked the building. The building shook and the men were lifted off their feet and sent spinning around. This I could sense and see as I was propelled skyward with the sergeant. When I recovered and scrambled to my feet, the world was blacked out. I called out in orders to evacuate the building. I was appalled as my men staggered out, blinded with dust and smoke, and in many cases covered in blood from cuts received from glass. Now, it's amazing that not all of these men were actually killed in that explosion. Many were wounded, but thankfully it seems that only one was possibly killed. But here we have an image of the second explosion, because when the Public Records Office goes up, a lot of damage done. Paddy O'Brien is wounded, the wounded are taken away. A few hours pass and then the actual major explosion happens, which you see documents flying all over the city. And it's after this that the forecourts garrison are forced to surrender. They're lined up on the quays, they're taken to Jemieson's distillery in Smithfield, and that is the forecourts taken. However, the fighting was not over, because remember Sean Prendergast, that mobilisation order went out that all of Dublin was to get ready for the fight, and that is what happens. Now, we have this account from Annie Farrington. An amazing account. Very rare for a civilian to give such an account because she had only bought Barry's Hotel a couple of months before, the year before, and she is setting herself up. She's getting ready for business when her hotel was occupied and taken over by the anti-treaty IRA. Now, they'd been there before the forecourt was taken over. They left and she thought that was grand. They've gone. However, once the attack on the forecourts began, they came back. Now, Annie Farrington saying here, this is one of the few photographs that we have of Annie, and thanks to Micheál of Dublin for finding this photograph. But Annie Farrington could not leave Barry's Hotel. This is the predicament that the civilians found themselves in, because she knew that if she left that hotel, if she left for a business, if that business went up, she would still have to pay the bank back. She would have to pay her mortgage. And that is why she refuses to leave. Now, all the guests are told to get out. The anti-treaty IRA, who included Brewer, De Valera is there at one stage, as he says here, Countess Markovich is there. Some are sent then to occupy what becomes known as the block. But the anti-treaty IRA mined her hotel. So eventually when they left, they were prepared to blow up that building. And she begged them not to do that. Thankfully, they didn't connect the mine. Although there was damage done to her building, she was able to save the building, reopen her business, even when the fighting was still going on. But this is an ordinary person's experience of the Civil War in Dublin, in North Inner City, Dublin. Just to point out to you, see, Barry's Hotel was very popular with the GAA, especially the Kerry teams, and this photograph is actually of a final, an All-Ireland final, a couple of years after the Civil War ended. The two men circled are Con Brosnan and Joe Barrett, both on the Kerry team, but during the Civil War had been on opposite sides in the Civil War. But Annie Farrington, her witness statement available on Military Archives, a fantastic account of what it was like for a civilian. Now, here we have the block, and pretty much it was a block of buildings on the east side of Upper O'Connell Street. Now, firstly, the anti-treaty IRA, they took over the wrong side of the street. If they had occupied the buildings on the left-hand side, at least you would have had a closer link to the forecourts. However, they don't. They take over the other side. And when the National Army forces realised this, they pretty much just occupied the left side of the street, and they cut that link between the block and then the forecourts garrison and those that are in Capel Street. But what you had from what's now Brewer Street right down to Cathedral Street, all of those buildings, the Gresham Hotel, the Granville, the Hammond Hotel, all of those buildings were tunnelled through, creating just this one massive defensive position. It's like they forget what they had achieved in the War of Independence with the guerrilla tactics. They revert back to what they did in 1916, and it is a disaster. Now, in this building, you have Brewer, you have people like Todd Andrews, you have others like Sean Dowling, De Valera is there for a time. There are upwards of 30 women that are also in the block, members of Cumann na mBan. And just like the forecourts, the block was bombarded by the pro-treaty side. Now, just to also point out to you the other positions that you took over in and around the city, because it's not just O'Connell Street, and you can see it here. They were also in number 44, Parnell Square. They're in Rutland High Street, they're in Dorset Street, they're in Granby Row, they're in the Granville Hotel, they're also in the Sackville Club, the Edinburgh Club, Boyle's, Hickey's that are in Talbot Street, Nolan's Hotel also in Talbot Street, the anti-treaty IRA are also in Amiens Street, they're in Barry's Hotel, the Plaza Hotel, Fleming's Hotel in Gardner Place. So you can see pretty much all of the North Inner City has outposts being held by the anti-treaty IRA. But the main focus of the attack is the block. Now, what you see is pretty much what the British did in 1916 to end the 1916 Rising. The pro-treaty side decided to try and isolate the block, so deal with all the little positions first, and then that will leave an encircle of movement and completely encircle the main building, which is the block, and that's exactly what they do. Now you have anti-treaty IRA in Moran's and Hughes Hotel in Gardner Street. And what the pro-treaty forces do is they bring up an armoured train and they place it on the bridge. And from there, that's where the attack moorings and hews. So one by one, the positions do fall until the block is completely isolated. And they bombarded the positions with 18-pounders, with big guns. You have the armoured cars being brought into play. And in one coming up O'Connell Street, you have 2 armoured cars that are literally edging each way a little bit by little bit. So an armoured car will go a certain distance and you'll have the cover and fire on the block, and then the other armoured car will come up behind that, and that's the way they go until eventually they reach the block. They're up right in front of it. And this photograph here, you see the soldiers actually bringing the 18-pounder gun, which was positioned at the bottom of Henry Street and Nelson's Pillar. So you have the cover being provided there, also from the armoured cars. But this photograph here is quite a sinister photograph, because there is one instant that happens that as the soldiers are making their way towards the block, they see a person on top of one of the buildings holding out a white flag, and they think that is the garrison surrendering. So they do make their way, they do advance. But then they open fire on them, and a number of soldiers are wounded. And the person inside the block was not trying to surrender. They were trying to warn the soldiers that the ground floor of the buildings had been mined. And you just wonder, is that photograph just moments before that event happened? Who are those soldiers that are making their way across? Did any of them survive after that photograph was taken? It's just a very eerie photograph. But eventually the block, like the four courts, it falls. Now, while you have that encircling movement taking place, you have the block itself becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, because each building, it gets set alight. And eventually the garrison retreats to the last tenable position, which was the Granville Hotel. Now, it's a small garrison there. Brewer, who was in charge, he gives orders that everyone is to go. He is the last to leave the building. Now, the National Army got so close to them that they're in Thomas Lane, right at the back of the hotels. Now, the garrison come out. People are looking for Brewer. He emerges in a doorway. He did have his revolvers, and he's called on to surrender. Now, the soldiers were ordered to shoot, but not shoot to kill, shoot to injure. But unfortunately, when he was shot, it was one bullet that severed a femoral artery. So what British bullets and grenades could not do in 1916, it takes one bullet fired by a fellow Irishman to kill Carl Brewer. And he's killed on the 7th of July, and on the 10th of July his funeral takes place. And unfortunately, Brewer is the first of many key figures in the Republican movement, giants of the Republican movement, that will fall in the Civil War. And then we come to the death of Collins, which is a huge turning point in the Civil War, because with this, we really see an increase in the reprisal killings that will then dominate the Civil War over the next couple of months. And although Collins was killed down in Cork, we see the members of the Dublin Fianna, the Fianna Éireann, paying the price for this. And it happened 4 days after Collins' death. So we have the murder of Alfred Coley and Sean Cole, who had been members of Na Fianna. Now, while you have members of Na Fianna in the Four Courts in the Public Records Office, Na Fianna weren't really active, but then Na Fianna, who predominantly went anti-treaty, they do have a meeting where they decide they are going to throw in their lot with the anti-treaty IRA. And a thing with Na Fianna was that it was made up of young men. As soon as a boy became 16, 17, they automatically graduated into the ranks of the IRA. So you've got this constant stream of soldiers feeding into the anti-treaty IRA. Na Fianna is singled out. And their murder is like sending a message to Na Fianna, stop what you're doing. Now, the thing is, Coley and Cole were picked up in broad daylight in front of witnesses in the north inner city. They were taken out to Yellow Lane. And it seems that the murder squad, it was made up of National Army soldiers. Where they were brought to was a country lane. However, the gateway was locked and they were murdered in front of people in broad daylight. The inquest follows. There is witness after witness after witness testifying as to what happened. There is a verdict of willful murder by persons unknown. And unfortunately, that sets the scene of what is going to happen over the coming months. But Cole and Coley are the first of many young men that will fall at the hands of a murder gang that is operating in Dublin. It's soon followed by the murder of John Joseph Stevens. Now, he was from Gardner Street and he's taken from his home, but then his body was found dumped out on the outskirts of Dublin City on the south side. And this again is a trend that follows. As I said, that happens in September. But then we have one of the biggest tragedies, one of the saddest events to happen in the Civil War, and it was the Red Cow murders. 3 young men taken from Clonliffe Road while they were putting up anti-treaty posters, threatening the lives of National Army soldiers living in the Clonliffe Road area. And the men were Edwin Hughes, Joseph Rogers and Brendan Houlihan, all from that area. Rogers, he was only 16 years old at the time. But what had happened was the posters that they were putting up, while they were putting them up, you have the arrival of Charles Dalton, who had been a member of Michael Collins' intelligence squad involved in Bloody Sunday, along with Nikki Tobin and other National Army officers who were returning from a night out at the Gaiety Theatre, were coming back to Clonliffe Road, bringing back Nikki Tobin's girlfriend. Dalton lived a couple of roads away from where those posters were being put up. So basically, when he sees these posters, what he sees is that I'm a National Army uniform and they're threatening to kill me. The 3 lads were taken into custody. Witnesses at the inquest said that when they were searched, Dalton said they had a gun, and at this time, anyone found with a gun or explosives could be arrested and later could be executed. But they're brought to Wellington Barracks, which was headquarters of military intelligence. The next morning, the 7th of October, their bodies were found dumped out at the Red Cow, again on the outskirts of Dublin City, but on the south side. Now, Dalton came in for particular scrutiny. He is the officer that arrests him, but so too was Nikki Tobin, who was there on the day or on the evening. I cannot say what happened or who killed him. What I do know is that Dalton and Tobin are there. We do not know what happened between Wellington Barracks and the Red Cow. What is suspicious, or what raises suspicions, was that at the inquest, Dalton did not appear. Nikki Tobin did. Other witnesses were called. Some of the other Free State soldiers that were there on the night were not called to give evidence, but Dalton has been blamed for this. I can't say for certain that he was involved, that he did carry out the killings. What I do know is that he arrested him, but that's all I know for definite. However, added to this is Nikki Tobin here, who was the brother of Liam Tobin, again a close associate of Michael Collins. He did give evidence at the inquest, and he actually differed. When he was asked, did you hear anything about the gun? Did you see the gun? He said no. 2 days after he gave evidence, Nikki Tobin was shot and killed in a National Army raid that was being carried out in Gardner Street. So you have all of these events that lead to so many accusations. There's a lot of uncertainty about this particular case, but there is no doubt that this is one of the most tragic cases in the Civil War. Now, I mentioned that the legislation was brought in that if you're found with a gun, you could be executed. And the executions began in November 1922. And this legislation was known as the Murder Bill. And basically, by the anti-treaty IRA, they said that any politician who voted for that legislation, who voted for that murder bill, was a legitimate target for assassination. Now, here we have a list. This was sent out to all the local IRA, and basically it is the names of the politicians, the pro-treaty politicians who voted for this bill. One of those was a man called OMalley, who was the last Count Corley of the Dáil. On the 6th of December 1922, the Free State officially came into being. On the 7th of December 1922, Sean Hales, a member of the 3rd West Cork Brigade IRA, pro-treaty side, and Pádraig O'Malley were leaving the Ormond Hotel on the north side of the city to make their way to the Dáil. I believed until recently that the only reason that Sean Hales was on his way to the Dáil was to ask or have questions raised about the death of Collins, to have an actual full inquiry done, carried out into the death of Collins, because that hadn't happened. And his brother Tom Hales was actually in charge of the ambush party in which Collins was killed. But Thanks to the release of the pension files recently, Nora Doyle of Commemorations in Kilpatrick, she was the Kilpatrick branch of Commemorations, she stated that Sean Hales was also on the way to Dáil to call a truce, to bring an end to the violence that was just going crazy all across this country. And he was going to resign if they didn't agree to this. Sean Hales didn't get to Dáil because as he and OMalley come out of the Armoured Hotel, they make their way onto a taxi, and at that moment, members of the anti-treaty IRA come out of side streets surrounding the Armoured Hotel, open fire, and Sean Hales, although not the target, he gets the full force of the attack. OMalley was wounded. Despite Jervis Street Hospital being minutes away, it was too far. By the time Sean Hales was brought there, he was dead. Now, in response to this, you have this happening, which are the executions, the reprisal executions. There is no other word for it, that were carried out by the pro-treaty side. Now, this was sending a message to the anti-treaty IRA that one side is going to win and it is going to be us. It will not be you. The four men that were chosen to be executed had been in prison, had been in Mountjoy jail since the fall of the four courts. Rory O'Connor, Dick Barrett, Liam Mellows, Joe McKelvey. They had nothing to do with the murder bill. They had nothing to do with that order that was given out to assassinate people who had voted for the murder bill. W.T. Cosgrave, the president of the executive, in a newspaper interview in answer to why these executions were carried out, and he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he and Richard Mulcahy, the night before Hales was assassinated, were having a meeting to discuss, again, offering clemency to the anti-treaty IRA. But with the death of Hales, the only way to deal with them was to smash them. And then after this, we see the executions ramping up, but also we see the murders increasing. And what is really tragic about this is Dick Barrett, West Cork, very good friend of Sean Hales. The family were totally horrified that Dick Barrett was chosen to be executed. The four men were actually chosen to represent each province of Ireland. Barrett was Munster, Joe McKelvey was Ulster, Liam Mellows was Connacht, and Rory O'Connor was Leinster. And Rory O'Connor, of course, was the best man at Kevin O'Higgins' wedding, Kevin O'Higgins being the last one to say, yes, he is to be executed. We continue into the new year, and as I say, the murders continue. You have people being just taken off the streets, people being shot on the streets by this gang that is operating. And again, the North Inner City is the place where this is happening. It's happening on both sides of the city. But here we have, in April 1923, James Tierney, who was also anti-treaty IRA. He was fatally wounded during a raid in Dorset Street. And here we have from his pension file an account from his commanding officer, because it was said that he was shot actually carrying out a robbery. And this is from his commanding officer saying, no, he was in active service when he was actually shot. He was shot by the person who actually owned the shop. And there we have the Insomnia, which is the actual location of where the original building was. And whereas the Red Cow murders were awful, and you would think that it could not get any worse, we then have this event, the kidnapping and murder of Noel Lamass. Now, the reason that this is so tragic is because this happens when the Civil War is over. Noel Lamass from Capel Street, veteran of the 1916 Rising, War of Independence, older brother of Sean Lamass. Now, Noel Lamass was very active in the Civil War. He was arrested. He was actually escaped twice from custody, made his way to England. Now, he wants to come back, and he wrote to his boss. He got his job back in the council, and he wrote to his supervisor saying, can you please let them know, basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, I will not be involved in any further violence. I do not want to have anything to do with what's going on. I just want to get back to normal life. He comes home. And on the 3rd of July, he was with another person and he was kidnapped. He's literally bundled into a car near Exchequer Street, as far as I know, that's where it happened. And he's never seen again. Now, the newspapers, week after week after week, you've got appeals from his parents, his mother and father, are looking for any information. They're putting in descriptions. This is what he looked like. And every time there was a body found somewhere on the north side of the city or on the south side, they thought it was him. And they would go and they would be, no, it's not him. So it's just prolonged and prolonged and prolonged. And this is July. And eventually on the 12th of October, the word comes through. that remains was being found, and it was remains. They identified him by his clothing. That's the only way they could identify him. And his remains were found in the feather beds in the Dublin Mountains. Now, that is not where he was actually murdered. It seems that his body was moved. But this is one of the most saddest events to happen in the Civil War. And we have this memorial, and it's such a lonely place where that memorial is. But I've just touched on some of the events that happened in the north inner city of Dublin in the Civil War. What I hope this talk has shown is that the Civil War, it's not just the big names, it's not just the big cities. Every street, every community has a story to tell in relation to the Irish Civil War. North side of Dublin, south side of Dublin, we all have a connection to this history. It is our history. And thank you for listening to me. Thanks very much.